Over 30 years ago, during the days of Arena's development, Bethesda was a much smaller and less famous company than we know it to be today. Before they ever started making RPGs, they were mostly known for their licensed games related to sports or movies, which were just barely making enough money for them to stay afloat. By the time they got around to making the Elder Scrolls Arena, their financial troubles had brought them to the point where there were fewer than 20 people on the development team, and the game had to be finished in less than a year. A necessary part of any game development cycle is beta testing, and Arena was no exception to this. These beta testers, who went without pay, were frequently sent new copies and builds in order for them to give feedback, and the ones that had become fans of the game and showed consistent interest were deemed the Council of Wisdom. Arena had eventually grown to become a cult hit, as well as a financial success, which naturally led to a sequel, being Daggerfall. The developers had remained in contact with the Council of Wisdom, informing them about their plans for the game, like the new character creation mechanics. They also shared their plans for expanding the world's lore through in-game books, which is something that didn't exist in Arena. Ted Peterson, one of the series' creators, says that some of the earliest books he wrote were intended for the Council of Wisdom. For example, the Brief History of the Empire series was created in order to give them a quick and broad overview of Tamriel's history, none of which was ever really shared in Arena. Whenever new bits of lore were shared with them, they would give feedback, and some of them would even go on to create their own fanfiction and stories. Thus, a sort of collaboration began between the Council and the developers, where they worked together to create the early foundational lore of the Elder Scrolls. In these early days of the development of the Elder Scrolls, Bethesda didn't have the money or resources to pay their testers. So, in exchange for their efforts, the developers would include works written by them in the game. Most of these were miscellaneous short stories that don't appear in future games, but these also include some of the more famous ones, as well as ones that are pretty prevalent lore-wise. For example, the books King Edward, which is the longest in-game book in the series, The Real Baronziah, and Biography of Queen Baronziah were all written by council member Marilyn Wasserman, the last two being written at the request of Ted Peterson. The early drafts of From the Memory Stone of Makeleleki, Redguards, Their Histories and Heroes, Notes for Redguard History, as well as The Vod the Singer, which are essentially the foundational texts for Redguard lore, were all written by a council member who went by Dave. Ebenarm, perhaps the most well-known minor deity in the series, was the alter ego of another one of the council members, Raymond Whit Crowley, who also wrote the book that introduced him, the Ebon Arm. Many of the other minor deities and characters seen across the Iliac Bay in Daggerfall also had their names derived from testers, as a way to immortalize them in the setting. For example, Joan and Jode, the early names for Tamriel's moons, Master and Secunda, were named after testers Judy Weller and Joan McCown. We can also see this in the deities Jeffrey, Jim Say, and Vigril, who were named after Jeff Grulich, Jim Safer, and Virgil Rochovansky, among many other examples. But without a doubt, the biggest way that these council members were honored was through the naming of the divines. Kinnereth was already mentioned in Arena, and Julianos was named after Julian LaFay, the game's director, but the other 6 out of the 8 original divines, being Akatosh, Arkay, Dibella, Mara, Stendar, and Zenithar, all had their names derived from Council of Wisdom members. Akatosh came from beta tester Lawrence Shidlovsky, who often signed off on his posts with the line, also known as the Old Smaug himself. When you take the first letter of each of these words and put them together, you get Akatosh. RK came from RK Deutsch, Dibella came from Mary Jo Dibella, Mara came from the previously mentioned Marilyn Wasserman, Stendar came from Daniel Starr, and Zenithar came from Stefan Zepp. And with how the lore of the Elder Scrolls has built on itself for over 30 years, we can still see these texts, as well as the names of the divines, frequently mentioned throughout later games. It's pretty minor in the grand scheme of things, but I think it's honestly really cool to see how some of the foundations of the Elder Scrolls were laid down by beta testers, not just the developers, and that we can appreciate their work and contributions all this time later. It's a testament to how The Elder Scrolls isn't just a series of games. It's an expansive universe, with a devoted community that's still building upon it to this day.